When we think of a clinical psychologist today, we picture this super-trained, highly regulated professional, right? But that identity didn't just appear out of thin air. It was actually forged in some pretty intense battles over trust, money, and what it even means to be a mental health expert. So let's dig into how this whole profession was built, piece by piece.
So as clinical psychology just exploded in popularity, a huge problem popped up. With all these new practitioners flooding the field, how could the average person tell a real expert from a total charlatan? The profession had to figure out a system that could do two things at once: guarantee its members were actually competent and, protect patients from getting hurt. This became the absolute foundation for everything that came next.
And really, it all boils down to this one simple question, the one that drove the profession for decades. Who actually gets to use the title psychologist? And what are the rules of the road they have to follow? Believe me, the answer was not simple. It had to be built from the ground up.
The first and biggest hurdle was just establishing basic trust. In the early days, with practitioners popping up everywhere, the public was basically flying blind. There was just no way to know who was truly qualified to be providing mental health care.
So the profession took a really crucial first step. And it wasn't about controlling what people could do. Nope. It was about defining who could legally call themselves a psychologist. It was all about title protection. The idea was to create a baseline of trust by just reserving that specific title for people with a certain amount of training.
But look, protecting the title was just the start. If clinical psychology was going to become a truly legitimate field and, carve out its own territory away from the world of psychiatry, it needed a much, much stronger system of regulation. This slide here illustrates the process perfectly. You can think of it like a regulatory staircase that the profession built, climbing step by step toward more authority. It all started with certification, which, as we said, just protected the title. Then came licensing, which was a huge leap. It defined what you could actually do. After that, board certification, which demanded proof of real hands-on skill. And finally, at the very top, the National Register, which created a public directory of experts you could trust.
Now, what's really fascinating is the huge jump between that first step, certification, and the second one, licensing. See, certification was about who you are. It was about the title. But licensing was all about what you can do. It set a much tougher standard that strictly defined the services a psychologist could offer, and, this is key, what they could charge money for. It basically restricted the practice of psychology to only those who could clear this much higher bar.
And those licensing standards, they were incredibly high. This wasn't just about getting a degree. We're talking a PhD minimum. Then, several years of supervised postdoc experience. On top of that, you had to pass a grueling national exam, the EPP, and meet a bunch of other administrative hurdles. This created a serious barrier to entry, making sure only the most qualified people could actually practice on their own.
But they didn't stop there. The standards just kept getting higher. The profession moved way beyond just written tests. The American Board of Professional Psychology, or ABPP, started doing things like live observation, literally sending examiners into clinics to watch psychologists work with real patients. Then in 1975, the National Register was created. This was a game changer, a public directory that let patients look up verified experts, check their specialties, and basically shop around for care with confidence.
Okay, so just as psychology is finally getting its own house in order with all these internal rules, an enormous external force was about to change everything. And that was a massive economic crisis in the wider world of healthcare.
So here's what went down in the 80s and 90s. The spark was all this incredible new medical tech, like MRIs and CT scans. They were saving lives, but they were astronomically expensive. This led straight to a crisis. The old fee-for-service insurance model, where insurers just paid whatever bills doctors sent them, completely fell apart. It was unsustainable. The reaction? The birth of managed care, a brand new system designed for one thing: controlling costs.
Now, managed care came in a few different flavors. You had DRGs, which basically gave hospitals a fixed budget for each diagnosis. You had HMOs, which locked patients into a specific network of doctors for a flat fee. And then you had PPOs, which offered a little more freedom with a list of approved providers. But the goal was always the same: put a cap on spending and shift the financial risk.
Now, this whole new system wasn't just good or bad for psychology. It was a true double-edged sword. It created a ton of friction for patients and therapists alike, but it also, surprisingly, sparked some really vital improvements in the field.
These strict financial limits created this fundamental conflict. On one side, you had all the friction and frustration, which you can see right here. But on the other side, well, these same pressures accidentally kicked off some of the biggest changes in how therapy was actually delivered.
Let's break that trade-off down. The cons were pretty obvious. Patients were seriously unhappy with random caps on their therapy sessions and what felt like a loss of personalized care. But look at the pros. These financial pressures forced psychologists, psychiatrists, and social workers to actually team up and collaborate. They brought in strict accountability, making therapists justify their treatments. And maybe most important of all, they drove the development of brand new, super efficient forms of therapy. And this slide just shows the result perfectly. The old Freudian model of this tangled, open-ended psychoanalysis that could drag on for years, it just wasn't affordable anymore. So in its place, we got the brief therapy model, goal-oriented, short-term treatments designed to get people functioning again quickly, often in just 8 to 12 sessions. This was a total paradigm shift, driven almost entirely by money.
So, with its professional house finally in order and its practice models totally reshaped by these new economic realities, the field of clinical psychology started to push outwards. It entered a new battlefield to expand its own scope of practice.
And that push led straight to the prescription debate. For about a century, psychology was all about talking therapy. But now, advocates started arguing that, hey, with all their training, psychologists already have a deep understanding of psychiatric meds. And the reality is, 80% of these drugs are prescribed by general practitioners anyway. So the argument became, if a family doctor can prescribe them, why on earth can't a more highly trained clinical psychologist?
This became one of the most polarizing issues in the entire field. Advocates were pushing for holistic, one-stop care, especially in rural areas, and they argued it would create more competition and efficiency. But the pushback was fierce, not just from the medical establishment like the AMA, but also from within psychology itself. Some are worried they'd lose the profession's 100-year legacy of talk therapy, or worse, just become junior psychiatrists.
And this fight for new privileges didn't just stop with medication. Oh no. The next frontier was hospital rights, the authority to independently admit patients, to direct their treatment on the hospital floor, and to have the final say on when they get discharged. These were all things that used to be exclusively for physicians.
So, has this push actually been successful? You bet it has. Get this, today a surprising 16% of all clinical psychologists in the US now hold medical staff privileges. This is not a theoretical debate anymore. That barrier is actively being broken down.
As the source material makes crystal clear, the profession is aggressively pushing for the legal right to prescribe medication. This is an active, ongoing fight. The very identity of a clinical psychologist is being reshaped as we speak, expanding to include responsibilities that would have been unthinkable just a generation ago.
So what are the big takeaways here? First, that psychology's authority was never a given. It was built on purpose through a step-by-step regulatory process. Second, that massive economic forces completely changed the way therapy is actually done. Third, that the controversial system of managed care, for all its flaws, also forced positive changes like accountability and teamwork. And finally, that this evolution is nowhere near finished.
Which leaves us with one last, really fascinating question to think about. As the lines between a clinical psychologist and a psychiatrist just keep getting blurrier, with psychologists getting prescription and hospital rights, what does the mental health professional of the future even look like? That's a question the